Welcome to Liberty and Justice with your host, Matt Whitaker.
Welcome to Liberty and Justice. I'm Matt Whitaker. I'm the former acting Attorney General of the United States. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share my thoughts and talk every week with thinkers, leaders, and doers across this country that care deeply about our country. Thank you to CPAC for streaming this show every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time as part of their CPAC Now lineup. You can also connect with me at whitaker.tv. Before I get to my guest, Ric Grenell, I want to share what is on my heart this week. As I travel around this country, I get many opportunities to speak to our fellow Americans. And what we talk about is what will restore American greatness. One of those things is the citizen servant. This is the concept that a citizen raises their hand at whatever level they choose. Then after serving a limited time, they go back to their community and live under the laws that they passed. The power is with the people, and career politicians can never fix our country or restore our republic from within. You know, the American dream does not exist without America. There is no French dream, there is no German dream. We are a beacon of freedom and opportunity throughout this world. The American dream is only limited by one's imagination, grit, perseverance, and an ability to define and achieve your own success on your own terms. I learned this from growing up in the Reagan era, and his doctrine of peace through strength was so important to American supremacy. Strong American leadership is good for the world. Reagan taught us the winning recipe, in addition to strong American leadership, is that success for our country includes limited government coupled with personal responsibility. You know, there's an ever-growing threat from the East, and that is China. Through fentanyl distribution, IP theft, and so many other ways, China is trying to destabilize and dethrone America as the world's superpower. We cannot and must not allow that to happen, and I look forward to exploring that here on Liberty and Justice. Thanks for joining me today on Liberty and Justice, where we not only discuss the many challenges our great country face and the unique challenges that only we can solve, we talk about common sense, practical solutions to those problems. I'm optimistic about our future, and our best days are certainly ahead of us, but only if we come together with a shared purpose of restoring this great republic to its foundational principles like individual liberty, economic prosperity, and limited government. Please sign up for our newsletter at whitaker.tv to stay in touch so you never miss a thing. Today's guest is Ambassador Ric Grenell. A great American, Ric served as Trump's ambassador to Germany and director of national intelligence. Great to be joined with my good friend Ric Grenell, former ambassador to Germany and director of national intelligence. Ric, thanks for joining us.
Matt, I almost don't recognize you without a tie on.
I did this for you. You know, every time that we've appeared together, you wear an open collared shirt and maybe a blazer, oftentimes a vest. And I'm starting to take advice.
Today. Yeah, it looks good.
Thank you. Good. You know, I have good advisors that dress me. So let's get right into it. You know, I mean, this is like a timely conversation because I'm watching, like a lot of Americans, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. And why don't you tell me and tell us what's happening, why it's happening, and then what Joe Biden and his administration are completely getting wrong as it relates to that situation.
So I think it's important just to remember that, during the Barack Obama administration, the Russians, Putin, rewrote the borders of Europe by grabbing this area of Ukraine called Crimea, and they just took it, and there were no consequences. And I think you've got to understand that when Putin grabs a part of Ukraine and says, "This is now mine," and Europe just kind of wrings its hands and complains, but no other action, and the United States doesn't really take any action, I think that he learns a big lesson. What's interesting to me, though, Matt, is that from 2016 to 2020, Putin didn't do any of this. He didn't move. He didn't try to go on borders. It was quite astonishing. He was in his best behavior mode, and I think that's because of Donald Trump. I will say this, that I heard from European leaders constantly when I was ambassador in Germany. And they would say it as a complaint, but they would always say to me, I don't know what your president's going to do. He's very unpredictable. And they meant it as a negative, and I remember always smiling, thinking, that's exactly what we're supposed to do.
Crazy like a fox.
But yeah, and I think that's where we are, is that from 2016 to 2020, Putin was well behaved, and now he's defaulted back to the Barack Obama, Joe Biden days, since Joe Biden is president. And look, he's moving troops to the border. He's threatening Ukraine again. He's always tried to threaten Ukraine. Now, one thing to remember about this region is that Putin does not want to see an expansion of NATO. That is the one thing that you have to understand. He doesn't like NATO. The former Soviet countries that are now members of NATO have always frightened him. They're too close to his border. And he's made that clear, even in the Trump administration. President Putin would say, I just don't want to see an expansion of NATO. My position, and I think the Trump administration's position, was always like, I'm not sure we should be expanding NATO when the current countries aren't paying their NATO obligations. Why are we going to extend this umbrella to new members when we're not even getting the full participation from the current
And
members?
it feels like, I'm sorry to interrupt, Rick, but it feels like that the NATO allies always turn to us to fix this problem and are expecting us to put our troops somehow in Eastern Europe to.
But I think we're to blame, Matt. I mean, are we? Why
Yeah.
wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they do it? And to be honest, I've been in the conversation with Chancellor Merkel and President Trump, and I've watched them communicate, and there's incredible respect there. But I have been in that room when President Trump would say to Chancellor Merkel, look, I don't blame you. I don't blame you for not paying your NATO obligations and not paying money when you have been allowed to, by a consecutive American presidents, to not pay your fair share, and yet Americans have 50,000 troops in your country protecting you. Is any other countries, Iran, is North Korea, is Russia going to invade Germany when there's 50,000 American troops? The answer is no. So why wouldn't she want to do it on the cheap? And remember that the Germans have a budget surplus.
Yeah.
Think about that. And I get annoyed with the Germans. I like the people very much, and I was always very respectful, even with Chancellor Merkel. But she knew exactly where I stood, because I would be blunt. When I was there, we had watched right down the street in Berlin, and this is a situation that didn't get a lot of press, but the North Koreans ran a hotel, a hostel, in the middle of Berlin, and they were getting money. But yet the UN had North Korea under sanctions for its nuclear ambitions, and yet Germany, the largest economy in Europe, was like, oh, we're fine with this hotel from the North Koreans in the middle of Berlin. And when I got to Berlin, most people at the embassy was like, oh yeah, this has been around for decades. You can't do anything about it. And I was like, the heck I can't. This is ridiculous. And so I just went after it and said, what are you doing? You're flouting, it's just beyond me. They would ignore international sanctions and they would get away with it. So it's by the way, we did get that youth hostel shut down while I was there, and there wasn't a big fanfare about it, but we did. But here is the problem with the Germans, is that they have a Germany first economic model. They definitely want to trade with everyone. They want to sell cars to everybody. They don't share the same threat assessment. They don't believe Iran's going to bomb them. They don't believe Iran's going to attack them, or North Korea's going to attack them, or Russia. They have a great relationship. And so we should not be scrambling to have a totally same policy between U.S. and Germany when they don't share the same threat assessment.
And with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which my understanding, because you were right there on this as it was being constructed, but my understanding is that essentially that bypasses the Ukraine, which was usually the terminus of the natural gas pipeline, and takes it more into the heart, and maybe it takes it all the way to Germany. And you were outspoken, like we shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. Biden has now threatened to shut it down, even though he green lighted it to recently. And so,
Took off the sanctions. He gave him the
yeah,
green light.
and
He
so
gave him the
it
green
seems
light.
to me that is that the only tool we have to keep Russia from essentially making Ukraine a satellite state?
It's a good question. I think it's also important to kind of talk about why we're against Nord Stream 2, right? So the United States has a policy that we believe other countries, including ourselves, should have a diversified supply of energy. No one should get energy from one country, and it's obvious. You don't want that other country who's supplying you energy to overly leverage against you or cause you to be beholden to them simply because you need their energy. You're trapped. And so the United States, believes that Nord Stream 1 is a part of Europe's diversified energy structure, including Germany's, but that Nord Stream 2 went too far. And so I always try to educate people to say, look, we're not against Russian gas. Of course, we buy some,
Right.
and we want to just make sure that it's not overly supplied. And so Nord Stream 1 is a part of it. Nord Stream 2 is not, in our opinion, a good thing to do. And so we've had that policy for a long time. But again, remember, Chancellor Merkel knew that the United States and others in Europe were against this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and she went ahead with it
Yeah.
anyway. She started building it during the Obama administration, and there was no big outcry back then. And I blame the Obama Biden administration for allowing that to even take hold. And so, now what we're hearing from Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the new Chancellor of Germany, is that if Russia invades, then they're going to do something with us about Nord Stream 2. I think that's a bunch of baloney. They didn't do anything when Crimea happened. When the Russians invaded Ukraine the first time and took land, Nord Stream 2 pipeline continued. And so I think that you have to look at the German energy models and realize they are desperate for Russian gas. Now, I'm going to finish with this because it really angered me. During the Trump administration, Chancellor Merkel told President Trump, told me multiple times that she would, and the German government would, build two liquid natural gas terminals inside Germany to receive liquid natural gas, some of which would be U.S. LNG, but it would also be other countries' LNG. But to be able to solve the diversification problem is, she would say, we're not beholden to Russia, and to prove it to you, we're going to build two new LNG facilities and we'll bring in a supply from other countries. That's what she promised. She told me constantly. She told President Trump that constantly. They canceled the two terminals as soon as Joe Biden got into office. So, I'm a tough diplomat, and I think that we can avoid war by utilizing economic sanctions and other tools of the U.S. government. I think the Biden team has just defaulted to troops on the ground and DOD and Pentagon and shoved the State Department right off to the side, because if they would have put sanctions on, or kept the sanctions of what the Trump team had put on for Nord Stream 2, we wouldn't be in this situation. Russia would not be able to be so belligerent and amass troops along the Ukraine border. But Joe Biden maximized and would rather have good relations with the German government because he believes, in the roar of the crowd applauding him more than he does in an America First policy.
And it seems to all the while Putin is very keen on who the president is, because like you said, in Obama administration, Obama Biden, they annexed Crimea, to use a probably they did more than annex it, but they essentially by force took over a warm water port. That was very important to their strategic ability to project power, because otherwise their only other ports were frozen some of the year. And now obviously they're trying to take some of this Ukraine in the Biden administration, because I think the calculus is the same, that they're not tough, and they're going to ultimately not be able to, I guess, stomach what it's going to take to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. What look in your crystal ball, Rick? I mean, you spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and you have a lot of relationships still. What do you think is the timeline if Russia's going to move, and what's it look like when they do move?
So I actually don't believe that Russia will do it, although we do have the history that after the Olympics, they moved on Crimea. So we've got to be concerned about what they're going to do after the Olympics. I think that's key. But I think that the Russians have already won. Their goal was to divide NATO, to make sure that we somehow had a disjointed non-unity in NATO. The Germans have successfully done that for them. The Germans have been very belligerent towards Estonia, telling Estonia not to provide hardware weapons for Ukraine. The Germans have been a terrible neighbor to the Ukrainians, and I think the Europeans see it. And the mistake that many Americans make, and I want to emphasize this, the mistake that many Americans make, including Joe Biden and the current crop of Democrats in Washington, is they assume that Europe is Paris and Berlin. And it's actually more than that. There are a whole bunch of other capitals.
Two lovely cities, by the way.
Yeah, they're amazing cities. I love Berlin. But Europe is so much bigger. The European Parliament said to the Germans, don't build Nord Stream 2, and they ignored that. So I think it's very clear and right to say that the Germans are a bad member of NATO, and they are being a bad member of the
Well,
EU.
and like you said, they're going to follow a Germany first policy that may be inconsistent with their allies. And that's what it appears in this situation especially.
It's certainly inconsistent with their rhetoric, right? Because now we have a government in Germany that is a coalition of the socialists, and the socialists, that's all. They ran commercials on, we're part of Europe, and you got to be a part of Europe, and Europe, Europe, Europe. But then they get in, and their policies are kind of like, screw you, Europe. We're gonna take whatever gas we want, no matter what you say.
Yeah, well, let's talk about and let's pivot to away from the Russian bear that I think is probably geopolitically less of a threat to the United States than the Chinese tiger. What is, from your perspective, what is our equivalent of NATO? Do we have an equivalent of NATO, or are we a little more exposed as it relates to, Chinese hegemony?
Such a good question. I think we're definitely more exposed. I think it's past time to kick the Chinese out of the WTO. More than 20 years ago, we brought the Chinese into the World Trade Organization because we thought, well, engaging them, and this was Bill Clinton's statement at the time, engaging with the Chinese and bringing them more towards capitalism is going to teach them how to do more of the rule of law and respect human rights and all of that. And I'm all for engagement. Yeah. I think that we should absolutely always try engagement. But you also have to benchmark engagement. And there needs to be a quick assessment a year or two after engagement to say, did this work? Is this working? And we've never done that with the Chinese, because if you step back and you look at the participation of China in the WTO more than 20 years ago, there's no other way to come to a conclusion other than to say they got worse. The being a part of the World Trade Organization did not bring China closer. Engagement did not work with the rest of the world. And so I think we've got to make some really tough decisions about China. We certainly have a guy in office right now, Joe Biden, who told us not to look at his son's laptop filled with all sorts of connections, money connections, corruption with Chinese officials. And what did they say in that campaign? And I still am adamant about calling this out, but they said, don't look at that Hunter Biden laptop because it's Russian disinformation. That's what the campaign said. And 50 former U.S. intelligence officials signed on to a letter and said, don't look at that laptop. Now, this was the last month of the campaign of 2020. That was a total political move. We talk a lot about manipulating intelligence for political purposes. That's exactly what they did in that instance, and they've never been called out. You have people like Leon Panetta, who signed that letter and has faced no scrutiny whatsoever from the media to say, why did you sign a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation? You said in that letter you had information.
Right.
You didn't.
Right.
There was no briefing. I'm the former acting DNI. I can tell you there wasn't anything, not even raw intelligence, that pointed to the fact that that was Russian disinformation. They've never been held to account.
Well, and isn't this sort of their go-to statement where they say, we have information? There's just kind of this DC whispering game where one person says there's information exists. I mean, same thing happened to Schiff, who said he had the goods that never, materialized, and ultimately, he was never held to account. But, again, it's a different standard, and you and I am.
Susan Rice, Samantha
Yeah.
Power. I mean, I could list everybody. That's why I declassified all of those transcripts and put them out there, because I saw what they said under oath that wasn't released to the public, and then I saw what they were saying on CNN and MSNBC to the public, and they were lying. And so releasing these transcripts to show that they were lying, I mean, look, you hit it on the head. This is the Washington game of Russia, Russia, Russia. And to be honest, that's the Beijing line. That's exactly what China wants you to do, is say, look over there, look at Russia. That is the Beijing strategy.
And the thing that you quickly realize when you spend any time in Washington, D.C., and it was, I was a little bit of a, Pollyanna-ish person before I came to the swamp and started to understand how it worked. But there is no story in the media that gets traction that does not have a fairly sophisticated public affairs campaign right behind it. And the reason these things have legs.
Usually those campaigns come from the newsroom.
Not only that, but they also, again, there are people that are being paid a lot of money. And, and I also think that the Russians, but especially the Chinese, are becoming very sophisticated at taking stories that divide Americans and amplifying them. And it's that simple. And it's, it's not $70,000 of Facebook ads. It's much more sophisticated than that. And unfortunately, again, based on what I'm watching and what I see, the social media companies especially, but the search engines and everybody else are fairly complicit in the promotion of some of these tactics.
Look, Russia's a problem. China's a crisis. That's why we shut down the consulate in Texas. We've had to really look at the reality of what the Chinese are doing and who they have compromised. And it's clear that when you compromise somebody on the Intelligence Committee, Eric Swalwell, that they have been wildly successful. And I go back to, and I keep pounding this, but the 50 former intelligence officials who signed that letter saying don't look at Hunter Biden's laptop, that's shameful. They manipulated intelligence, and they didn't have a single shred of raw evidence to.
And they really, they still, all those people that, like you said one thing when under oath, but said an entirely different thing when on the Sunday shows or on CNN or MSNBC. They still have their cushy contributor jobs, and they still, get to say whatever their, quote unquote opinion is. And it's, nobody's been held to account because, again, they're at worst useful idiots, but mostly they're just, singing from the hymnal of the left. And that is cherished in the newsrooms and in the editorial boards, in Washington, D.C. and in our major cities.
Yeah, and it's a problem, but I think, for conservatives, I think what we have to do is we have to stop expecting Washington, D.C. types to change. They're never going to tear down their city. I mean, you look at reporters who now live in Washington, D.C. They go to church there, their kids go to school there, they're wearing, hats from sports teams from Washington, D.C. We can't, we're ridiculous and stupid if we're going to ask those people who are entrenched in Washington to vote for or publicize why we should have smaller government. They're never going to do it. They love Washington. They want it to be big and bad. We've got a fight not between Republicans and Democrats, but between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country. And we conservatives that live outside of DC, we have to stop expecting that they are ever going to change their city
Right.
or the system. They love it and it works for them. So we've got to start sending people to Washington that don't have a social life or a church there, and that their life is back
Yeah,
home
true
somewhere else.
reformers, and that's why they hated Donald Trump so much. He was, he
Yeah.
actually, he wasn't from the swamp, didn't have relationships in the swamp, and they hated that.
Yeah.
Well, let's, we got so much to talk about, but I think that one of the interesting things that we're dealing with right now is this whole idea of the arc of democracy. And somehow, Republicans and conservatives like Tucker Carlson and, Sean Hannity and the folks on Newsmax, whether it's Salcido or whether it's, all those individuals are being accused of essentially being lapdogs for Putin and for China, and somehow the left is now wearing the hat, which is, again, this is crazy world. You have to understand, but is there only two sides? Can you only be either for authoritarian regimes or for democracy, or is there like a rational foreign policy of the United States that is America first, but also takes into account that we can't fight every war and in every continent?
Well, first of all, we have to stop. I mean, the answer is yes. We've got to be able to think outside of just black
Right.
and white. And yet, I think these arguments that we make that are in the middle work outside of Washington. They don't work inside Washington, D.C. And so, I think that one of the lessons is just to ignore that groupthink, that echo chamber of Washington, and listen to practical people on the outside. But the other thing is that Washington, D.C., we're stuck into immediately going, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but immediately going to the Pentagon for solutions, and we're pushing aside the peaceful part, the diplomacy. I mean, the State Department is flooded with people who don't know how to negotiate and don't know how to negotiate creatively. That we need to have a top-down restructuring of the State Department so that our diplomats are empowered to actually solve problems before we send in the Pentagon. I'm tired of having the State Department shoved off to the side while we rush into boots on the ground and then ask our soldiers to kind of fight for hearts and minds. That's the job of the diplomats. But every time we've had in the last decade a strong diplomat, they've mocked the diplomat as being undiplomatic, as if to say diplomacy is weak and you're just supposed to cut the baby in half and do this consensus. I mean, look, I think consensus sounds good and it's a good word, and maybe we can get there, and we should maybe try for it, but only if it's good for America, only if it is part of our policy. But you don't need funding of the State Department and diplomats if the solution is just, what do the Germans want, what do we want, and we meet in the middle. I mean, that's not diplomacy. Diplomacy is you fight for your ideas and you try to convince the other side that your way is going to be good for them. And I do think that an America first policy is good for the world. And our diplomats need to understand that they have to go sell why a strong America is good for the global economy and good for stability and good for peace and security. It's not a hard sell if you believe in it. And so I'm somebody who thinks I will never apologize for the America First strategy. It's not a selfish strategy. It's always made the world better, and it is the best system to help poor people become part of society and live their dreams.
You're right. And I've said this recently, in fact, at a dinner you and I were both at, and that is that the American dream, without America, there is no American dream. There's no French dream. There's no German dream. It is you come with nothing, and I've seen it in my own life with friends and others that really start with nothing but a desire to succeed, and they succeed on their own terms, and it's extraordinary. But I have to go back just a little bit. As I'm watching this Ukraine situation, I see Macron, and he's doing shuttle diplomacy. I see us send a deputy secretary of state to try to negotiate something. But is this a lead from behind? Am I seeing lead from behind again from the Biden administration? Because
You're talking about what do you want, Wendy Sherman. I mean, she literally is the worst negotiator known to the United States. She's failed in North Korea, she failed in Iran, and now she's like supposed to be leading our strategy with Russia.
Why
Are you
not send
kidding
Kamala
me?
Harris? Why not like actually?
Well, she is going to the Munich Security Conference, and she's supposed to be rallying the troops. I'm very proud, Matt, that yesterday, 2 years after I've been gone, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman uh, was still angry about Ric Grenell's diplomacy in Germany towards the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and how belligerent I was, she said. Um, I love the fact that they're still talking about our strong diplomacy and Trump's diplomacy all these years later. Meanwhile, they're celebrating Joe Biden. The Europeans and others are loving Joe Biden. But I would remind my friends in Europe that the last time you had Barack Obama and Joe Biden, a Democratic president, you had the beginnings of Brexit, the shrinking of the EU. You want to see the EU become weaker, then you can ignore all of your problems and realize that Crimea and rewriting of the borders in Ukraine are going to continue when you have a weak United
Right,
States.
and that's the thing. We need to not only be powerful, we need to use that power in a judicious manner. And I think that was, you mentioned President Trump and his stance where he was unpredictable. But I think he was also unpredictable that he kept all of his options open. Where he could, if he needed to use a kinetic solution, he could. But he that was not his first instinct. In fact, he was trying to get us out of the forever wars, not in the disastrous way that Biden ultimately did, but obviously understood that our major threats, are not coming from the Middle East. It's really.
Yeah, I would just add to that that the reason I think Trump did so well in foreign policy is because while he articulated that we want to come home and not start wars, he was also targeting terrorists and willing to
Mhm.
do that. Soleimani, he was really willing to utilize the Pentagon where he thought that it was needed, and to build up the Pentagon, the old Reagan peace through strength idea. I think that's really important when you're going to talk about coming home and bringing the troops home. Building up the military in case you need it is a real good
Yeah,
strategy.
that's a good point. It's a good point. So let's move on. Again, you and I could probably talk about just foreign policy all day long. I continue to learn. You've forgotten more than I can learn from you. So I think it's really interesting discussion. And every time we get together, I pick your brain on some of these so I can understand it better. But why don't you talk about a little bit about your effort with Fix California? Obviously, it's your home state, and you guys got all sorts of problems. I don't have to tell you that, but what's the vision? What's the plan? And tell me about the organization, and then tell me how people can get involved in Fix California.
Well, thank you. I mean, you can go to fixcalifornia.com and sign up. Fix California is really a long-term strategy. It's not a campaign, but it's a long-term strategy to fix the problems of California. Um, you know, we have a pillar system where one is we're going after every county and holding them to account, legally challenging them to clean up their voter rolls. And the second thing we're doing is we are trying to um, change the system through getting more engagement, right? So the idea would be taking conservatives who are currently sitting on the sidelines in California and getting them involved and telling them that there's a shot. We have a problem in California where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where people say, oh, we don't have any chance, and they're going to call the election at 9 p.m., so why vote? And what we found is 1.4 million conservatives are sitting on the sidelines unregistered. And so we've got to encourage people to register to vote. The third thing we're doing is we're supporting education reform, and we're really pushing the idea of school choice. We've got some internal politics in California trying to figure out how to do that and when best to do that. But we are supporting the idea that we should fund students, not systems.
And that's obviously the way of the future, and that's what's going to ultimately reform the schools is when they have to compete for students and deliver results for students. You're going to see, a lot of reform in education. So it's not a campaign. You're not just doing one referendum this election cycle. This is a
long-term
decade
effect.
plan.
I've told our donors, we can't be an ATM for the rest of the country anymore in California. We got to fund our people and our programs and our conservatives, and that's what the focus of Fix California is. So I'd encourage people to go to fixcalifornia.com, sign up. You'll get good California news. We hold Gavin Newsom to account. We hold Eric Garcetti to account, and I think you'll.
Yeah, no, I've been to that website. I think it's really a great long-term project because this is the thing. These things are not won in 3 months or even a year. I mean, this is obviously the long slide into the abyss that has happened to California is going to take a long time to climb back out of that. So anything I can do to help, let me know on that. So one of the things I learned recently, Rick, when we were together, is that you are an aficionado of mixed martial arts and the UFC. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your interest in that? And again, there's a fight this weekend on Saturday, and I think people would find that not so. I mean, you're an interesting guy, but I just think it's like surprising that Ric Grenell is a huge MMA fan.
So, as you know, I'm a huge MMA fan, and I'm, more than just a fan. I'm involved, and I know fighters, and I support fighters, and do what I can. It really started. This is crazy, but my dad, there's 4 kids in my family, 3 boys, and I'm the youngest. And my dad always wanted us to be in sports, and he would sometimes pick the sports when we were younger. And so, Ric Grenell was a wrestler as a young little kid in elementary school, and I was horrible. I was bad at it. My brothers were really good, but I was not good, and there's a lot of family stories that make fun of me for being a wrestler. But my dad wanted us to do things that challenged us, and so he made me do wrestling for a number of years, and I learned a lot. But I became a fan of it just because it's an incredibly hard sport, and I have reverence for it. And then you put on top of that the fact that my dad was a boxing judge and loved to go to Golden Gloves, and so as a kid I'd tag along with my dad, and I found a way during Golden Gloves where they needed the 12-year-old kid to go collect the ballots of the judges, and I would go collect the ballots, and I saw the power in that, Matt, because I was the first one to know who won the fight, right? I'd look at all the ballots, and then in those days you'd hand it to the announcer and he would look at it and figure it out. I had a blast doing that with my dad. So you combine wrestling, you combine, boxing, and then just the sheer entertainment of MMA and UFC, and I got to be friends with Dana White. And so when I went to Germany, I really tried to promote this American MMA UFC idea, and I started going to all of the German MMA fights, got to know all the German champs and the German fighters. I introduced you to some
good guys
who are amazing guys. You learn a lot from them, and you learn discipline. You learn really incredible discipline. And so I have great respect for the athletes who do UFC and MMA, and I'm a big fan and watch.
Well, I look forward to we've talked about maybe doing something at an upcoming fight, and I'm looking forward to that. I told you though that I always find when I'm watching MMA fights, I find myself almost contorting in the chair, taking on almost the fight myself. It's a really interesting, kind of pure athletic endeavor. And, it's just one versus one.
Well, it's going to get worse because Nasrat, who I introduced you to, fights on Saturday.
And I'm going to be watching that.
So you gotta watch Nasrat's fight from Houston, and
that's exciting. But I just thought that was something that I really enjoyed our time in Vegas, and that was a special dinner that we had. So the next thing I want to get theoretical, and not boring theoretical, but just like I think a lot about the Republican Party, but mostly about the conservative movement. And I came of age during Reagan and his 3-legged stool of kind of the what we had to win elections. And I'd love to hear, since you're a thought leader in so many places, including foreign policy. What do you think is the current conservative winning recipe in America? And kind of how do we get to that point?
Look, I've thought long and hard about this, and really, our theme of conservatives in the Republican Party really should be
Yeah.
small government, limited government, and personal responsibility. What comes with that is personal responsibility of making sure that you do what's right for your community, and you do it at that personally. But it's your personal liberties that get to determine kind of that moral compass of where you go. We believe in people, not in government. And so, because of that, I think the conservative movement is really about empowering the people that would benefit from smaller government. And I think that Donald Trump did an amazing job of articulating why minorities are going to benefit, why Hispanics, why blacks, why gays are going to benefit from a smaller government. Because the government, will articulate that we're going to take care of the minorities, but they don't.
Right.
They don't have enough money. They can't. And we are different people anyway. And so I think that what's been happening is the articulation of why personal responsibility with limited government is the solution for the people. I think that's really taking off. First and second generation Americans will give you an amazing tutorial of why this country's great. They don't apologize for America. They love America. They left fascism, totalitarianism, and they came here. And so they can really articulate why America is wonderful. And our problem is fifth, sixth, seventh generation white, rich people who are taking advantage of the fact that they live in the greatest country and they don't know it. And so they're critiquing it, and they're picking at it, and they're saying negative things about it, and they're causing this storm to say we've got to change America because it's not that great, because they're just focusing on the negative. And what I would say to those people is travel.
Right, and study history.
Go
I
around
mean,
the
study
world.
history as well, because as I've thought about those folks. I mean, I'm a seventh generation Iowan, so I mean, I'm deep roots in my a lot of the folks. If we trace back, kind of my family got here in the 1700s and sort of were farmers and miners and just working folks. And I've never, I mean, I don't, my attitude is if you don't understand history, and that's why these recent immigrants get it, people from Venezuela and Cuba and the places where they, have lost their country through, one of these ruthless autocratic dictators, they appreciate what we have and the freedoms we have. But you're so right. The personal responsibility is the key to that whole thing. And again, the issues change. This is the thing. It's hard to, write a book on this. You said this is what conservatives believe. Well, the political issues 2 years from now are going to change. But ultimately, it is so true that we have to be for limited government. You know,
Smaller government ideas are never going
no,
to
you're
change.
right.
Right? You're always limiting government, or when government is appropriate, making it temporary and
Yeah.
quick. The idea, they always say it's a safety net is what the government should be. I think it should be a trampoline where it bounces you right
Certainly not a
back up.
hammock.
And
I mean,
not a hammock, and not something that ensnares you
yeah.
like a
Yeah,
net.
yeah. One, as we wrap up here, I guess I have a question. Are you working on, or have you ever thought about a Grenell doctrine? Is there, because obviously, if you get to coin that, if there is a Grenell doctrine, then you can, if you get an opportunity, you could employ that, to great success. I mean, have you thought through sort of, peace through strength? Obviously, is one of the doctrines that we hear so much.
Yeah.
But what's your
I mean, I can't really say that I've thought about that in particular, but I think what I'm passionate about, what I try to talk about, what I try to point to is the fact that because I've been at the State Department for 11 years, and I know the State Department well, and I love so many people there, and I know all the Foreign Service officers. They're amazing people. They're smart people. They love their country, but they have been shoved
Right.
aside and told that they don't get to be tough diplomats. And I don't think that we have a system right now where we send in the diplomats into danger areas. Right now, we're in this mode where we immediately and quickly remove the diplomats and then send in the troops on the ground. And I think most people who join the Foreign Service or work at the State Department want to solve problems, and they understand the world is dangerous. And they do work in danger situations. We need to train up a better Foreign Service system, officers who will deploy into danger posts and do what diplomats do, which is avoid war. So I think that my mantra has always been, don't shove the State Department aside, and let's have diplomats with muscle. Let's try to solve the problems before we send in the troops, because we negotiate at the State Department. The Pentagon doesn't negotiate.
All right. Well, Rick, this has been a great discussion. I look forward to seeing you in person soon. And, if people want to learn more just about you generally, what's the best place to find you out there? I know you're very active on Twitter, but why don't you tell our folks?
Yeah, probably Twitter. Don't go to Wikipedia because it lies.
Amen. Amen. Well, I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it was great talking to you, Rick, and thanks for your time. Again, you can follow Rick on Twitter and Instagram at Richard Grenell. Link is in the show notes. Again, you can connect with us at whitaker.tv. I would like to thank CPAC for broadcasting this show every Friday at 7 p.m. on CPAC Now. You can, of course, find us on the internet. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Matt Whitaker 46. Great talking to you. Thanks for joining us. Next week, another great show. God bless.
Liberty and Justice with Matt Whitaker.